Rick Ross woke up feeling like the biggest boss on earth, and by dinner time Rick Ross was quietly cleaning up a mess Rick Ross did not see coming. In less than one full day, the same Rick Ross who was screaming about minions, losers, glazers, and telling Kareem Biggs Burke to come kiss the ring, suddenly sounded like a man who just remembered exactly whose ring the whole industry has been kissing for the last 30 years. That is not a mood swing. That is not a change of heart. That is the sound of a very expensive phone lighting up in the background, and somebody on the other end of that line was not calling to argue. Hold on, because this one is not the story you already scroll past on your timeline. Everybody online is stuck on the same loop. JayZ made a call. Ross apologized. Biggs won. Cute. Surface level. Baby pool depth. The real move happened before JayZ ever had to lift a finger, and Rick Ross walked straight into it, with his chain swinging and his mouth wide open. What Rick Ross bumped into was not a person. Rick Ross bumped into a structure, a quiet, 30-year-old structure built out of loyalty, prison time, silent partnerships, and one very specific rule of the streets that Rick Ross, of all people, should have remembered. Here is the setup nobody is spelling out for you. Rick Ross gets on the mic, wine glass in hand, feeling untouchable, and starts throwing shots at Rory and Mal from the old Joe Budden circle. Fine. Podcast beef. Standard internet noise. Nobody would have cared past Tuesday. But then Rick Ross does something extremely reckless. Rick Ross swings a camera off Rory and Mal and locks it directly onto Kareem Biggs Burke. Rick Ross starts talking about taxes. Rick Ross starts talking about going broke. Rick Ross starts talking about a 20-bag weed case from 20 years ago. Rick Ross tells Kareem Biggs Burke to come kiss the ring of the boss. And in that exact second, without Rick Ross even realizing it, an entire silent phone tree lit up across 3 cities. Because Kareem Biggs Burke is not a rapper. Kareem Biggs Burke does not need a diss track. Kareem Biggs Burke does not need a subliminal. Kareem Biggs Burke is one of the 3 original Rockefeller founders, standing shoulder to shoulder with JayZ and Damon Dashback when Reasonable Doubt was just a stack of CDs in a trunk. Kareem Biggs Burke did federal time, and according to every single person who has ever spoken about it, Kareem Biggs Burke walked in silent and walked out silent. In a business built on flipping on your friends the second the cuffs come out, that kind of silence is not just respected. That kind of silence is currency. That kind of silence is the reason billion-dollar deals get signed with a nod instead of a contract. Now stack that against Rick Ross's own resume, and this is where the story starts to bite. Rick Ross, before the beard, before the bosses, before the yachts, worked as a correctional officer. That is not gossip. That is a documented paycheck. And here is Rick Ross, decades later, wine in one hand, microphone in the other, mocking a man who did his time without opening his mouth. Every single old head watching the clip felt the same thing at the same time, a cold, quiet secondhand embarrassment. Because in the code Rick Ross claims to live by, that is not a diss. That is a self-report. Rick Ross basically stood on stage and reminded the whole industry which side of the bars Rick Ross used to stand on. And the internet noticed in real time. That is your first crack in the armor. The second crack came from a name Rick Ross never even mentioned out loud, but summoned anyway. Mal. Because Mal is not just some podcaster with a microphone. Mal is Kareem Biggs Burke's little brother. Read that again slowly. Rick Ross went after Mal thinking Rick Ross was fighting a podcast war, and instead Rick Ross basically walked into a family living room with muddy shoes on. In the streets, that is a specific type of mistake. In the boardroom, that is a specific type of mistake. In both worlds, that mistake gets corrected fast, and it does not get corrected with a diss track. It gets corrected with a phone call that never gets posted online. So let's talk about that phone call, because everybody is asking the wrong question. The question is not, did JayZ call Rick Ross? The real question is, how many people called Rick Ross, in what order, and what did each one of them say? Picture the sequence. First call, probably some old friend, voice low, saying, "Big bro, you know who you just named, right?" Second call, maybe from the label side, someone who is not going to shout, but is going to say something worse than shouting. Silence. Then, we need to talk about the calendar. Third call, if the reports circulating online carry any weight, from a person high enough on the food chain that Rick Ross does not send it to voicemail. And the reports say, in plain language, retract the statements. Whether that call happened exactly like that or not, one thing is publicly visible. Within hours, Rick Ross's whole tone flipped from king of the castle to careful with my words. Watch the second clip, and put it side by side with the first. In the first clip, Rick Ross is loud. Wine glass. Big laugh. Chest out. Kiss the ring. In the second clip, Rick Ross posts himself with a caption about it being a beautiful day to be a boss. And the energy is completely different. The eyes are not the same. The mouth is not the same. The little smirk is gone. Rick Ross looks like a man who just got off a very short phone call and is now performing unbothered for the camera. Anybody who has ever received a kind of message that reorganizes your whole week knows exactly what that face looks like. Rick Ross has that face. Now let the unique angle sink in, because this is the part nobody on your timeline is telling you. Rick Ross did not lose to JayZ. Rick Ross lost to something older and quieter than JayZ. Rick Ross lost to what old New York calls a room. The room is not a place. The room is a group of people who never trend, never post, never argue online, but who move the paperwork behind every major moment in this business. The room is publishing splits. The room is festival bookings. The room is who gets the sync placement on the next big Netflix trailer. The room is who quietly funds a tour when the label is dragging its feet. And the room has been decorated for 30 years with pictures of JayZ, Damon Dash, and Kareem Biggs Burke standing behind bottles of Armadale in dusty warehouses in Manhattan. You do not walk into that room with your shoes muddy and tell one of its founders to kiss anything. Rick Ross forgot that. Rick Ross forgot because Rick Ross has been the loudest boss in his own building for so long that Rick Ross started to believe the volume equals the power. But volume is not power. Volume is a symptom of power, and sometimes it is a symptom of the opposite. Real power in this business, the Kareem Biggs Burke kind of power, does not need a microphone. Real power sends a text and watches an entire 24-hour news cycle rearrange itself. Let us walk to the pattern, step by step, because the timeline is the whole crime scene. Day 0, morning. Rick Ross record the rant. Wine glass laughing, mocking Rory, mocking Mal, then locking on Kareem Biggs Burke. Day 0, afternoon. The clip hits every hip-hop blog and every gossip page inside of 2 hours. Day 0, evening. The smart account online start pointing out the Mal Biggs connection, and suddenly the algorithm is not feeding people a podcast beef anymore. The algorithm is feeding people a Rockefeller story. Day 0, late night. Rick Ross's team, according to how these things always move, starts getting messages that do not sound like fan mail. Day 1, before lunch, the tone flip, the soft caption, the retracted energy, the clarification that is not quite an apology, but is definitely not the same speech from the day before. And here's the part that turns this whole story from gossip into a case study. Rick Ross has done this exact kiss the ring energy on rappers before and has never once backed down. Rick Ross has stood on business with much bigger microphones than Kareem Biggs Burke. Rick Ross has traded shots publicly with names that pull 10 times the streaming numbers. Rick Ross does not blink for a diss track. So why did Rick Ross blink for a man who has not put out an album, has not gone on tour, and has not posted a single response? That is the question that unlocks the whole angle. Rick Ross did not blink because of a rapper. Rick Ross blinked because of a role. Kareem Biggs Burke does not play the rap game. Kareem Biggs Burke plays the business behind the rap game. And that game does not pay in streams. That game pays in access. And access is the one currency Rick Ross cannot afford to lose. Think about what access means for Rick Ross specifically. Rick Ross is not a new artist chasing a hit. Rick Ross is at the stage of a career where the money is in the ecosystem. Festivals, brand deals, Wingstop, MMG placements, documentary rights, publishing catalog conversations. Every single one of those doors sits inside the room we talked about. Every single one of those doors has at least one person on the other side who owes Kareem Biggs Burke a favor from 2001 or 2003 or 2008. So when Rick Ross went after Kareem Biggs Burke, Rick Ross was not risking a bad rap review. Rick Ross was risking every door Rick Ross needs to keep open for the next decade of income. That is not fear. That is math. And Rick Ross, whatever anybody says about him, is very good at math. Now let us drop in the other piece nobody is connecting. The Drake situation lurking in the background. Because remember, all of this is unfolding while Drake's album is dominating every conversation on social media. Rick Ross had already stepped into that Drake war on the side against Drake, and there's a well-known public statement from that entire moment where French Montana pointed out that French Montana was still cool with Drake, which made Rick Ross's participation look strange and personal instead of unified. So going into this Biggs moment, Rick Ross's public standing was already a little wobbly. Rick Ross was already under a magnifying glass. The internet was already primed to look for a slip. And then Rick Ross gave the internet a slip the size of a football field, mocking a federal silence, from a former correctional officer's mouth, aimed at a Rockefeller founder on camera with a wine glass. That is not one landmine. That is 4 landmines in one sentence. That is why the retraction was not optional. That is why the retraction was fast. That is why the retraction did not come with the usual Rick Ross swagger. The situation was not a beef. The situation was a business risk with a public face. And once Rick Ross recognized the face, Rick Ross moved. Fast. Here is where the human part comes in, though, because it is easy to make Rick Ross the villain of the story, and that is lazy. Rick Ross is not the villain. Rick Ross is a test case. Rick Ross is what happens when a very smart, very rich, very seasoned boss forgets, for one afternoon, that the streets and the boardroom share the same memory. Everybody has that afternoon. Athletes have it. Actors have it. CEOs have it. The only difference is that most people have that afternoon in private, and Rick Ross had it with a camera on. That is the real lesson buried in this whole story, and that is a lesson your favorite podcast is not going to spell out for you, because your favorite podcast want a villain, not a mirror. Look at the JayZ part again with fresh eyes. There's a famous clip that Rick Ross himself has repeated more than once, where Rick Ross talks about sitting down with JayZ back in 2008 before Rick Ross even turned in an album. In that clip, Rick Ross describes JayZ telling Rick Ross to stop writing to every beat Rick Ross liked and start writing to every beat Rick Ross could make work. Rick Ross calls that advice the moment that took me to another level as a writer, another level as an artist. Rick Ross even says on camera that when the bidding war for Rick Ross happened, JayZ walked into a meeting with L.A. Reid and told the room, Rozay is going to be the biggest boss they ever seen. That is not just a story. That is a debt. That is a public on record. This man believed in me before the checks did debt. Then, years later, Rick Ross climbs up on a live stream, wine glass in hand, and starts poking the man JayZ has stood next to since Marcy Projects. You do not need a leaked phone call to understand why the tone changed the next day. The math writes itself. And still, and this is important, nobody has publicly confirmed that JayZ picked up a phone at all. That part is speculation. That part is the internet filling in the blanks with the most dramatic story possible, because the most dramatic story gets the most clicks. It is entirely possible that Rick Ross woke up the next morning, watched the reaction himself, saw where the wind was blowing, and adjusted with zero outside pressure. That version is not as exciting, but it is possible. What is not speculation, though, is the visible timeline. What is not speculation is the tone flip. What is not speculation is that Kareem Biggs Burke got name dropped, and within hours the loudest voice in the room decided to lower the volume. Those are facts sitting in front of the camera, and those facts do not care whether JayZ ever dialed a number or not. Zoom out one more time, because this is bigger than Rick Ross and Kareem Biggs Burke. This whole moment is a preview of what the next era of hip-hop beef is going to look like. The era of trading verses on Instagram is closing. The era of the quiet phone call is opening. The generation that grew up on rap has now grown into the boards, the labels, the brand partnerships, the streaming committees, the festival ownership groups. The people who used to argue on radio are now signing the checks that pay for the radio. So when a modern artist tries to run the old playbook, mocking somebody with a mic, they are not fighting a person anymore. They are fighting an entire portfolio. And portfolios do not clap back on Twitter. Portfolios move calendars. Portfolios delay releases. Portfolios lose a submission for a sync placement. Portfolios can end a career without ever raising a voice. That is a world Rick Ross accidentally introduced everybody to this week, in real time, on camera, with a wine glass. Rick Ross ran the old playbook against a man who literally helped invent the new playbook. And the new playbook won inside of 24 hours without dropping a single bar, without recording a single verse, without even needing JayZ to speak. That is not a Rick Ross loss. That is a generational message. And Rick Ross was just a messenger. So where does this leave everybody involved? Kareem Biggs Burke publicly has said nothing. Kareem Biggs Burke does not need to. The silence is a flex. Every day Kareem Biggs Burke does not respond. The story grows for Kareem Biggs Burke and shrinks for Rick Ross. That is a masterclass in how power actually behaves when the cameras are on. JayZ publicly has said nothing. JayZ does not need to either. And honestly, given how JayZ has moved for the last decade, the odds of JayZ ever addressing this directly are somewhere between slim and never. Rick Ross has moved on promoting the May 29th live band show, which notably was framed on that same podcast appearance as something JayZ has done before. Shout out the HOV, pivoting the conversation right back into respect mode. Watch the pattern. The rant, the retraction, the redirect. 3 moves, all inside of a week, all pointing the same direction, away from the mistake. And that is where the story starts to feel less like gossip and more like a documentary you are going to be watching on a streaming service 5 years from now. Because at some point somebody is going to sit down and tell the full version of what really happened this week. Somebody is going to name the calls. Somebody is going to name the rooms. Somebody is going to describe in detail how one loud afternoon on a live stream turned into a very quiet lesson about who actually runs a machine. And when that documentary comes out, do not be surprised if the first shot is Rick Ross with a wine glass, saying kiss the ring, and the last shot is Kareem Biggs Burke sitting in a chair he never had to get out of. Rewind the whole week, and notice a smaller detail nobody is highlighting. Rick Ross did not just retract words. Rick Ross specifically retracted the words aimed at Kareem Biggs Burke, while leaving almost everything else in the original rant untouched. That is a surgical retraction. That is not somebody who woke up embarrassed by the whole speech. That is somebody who woke up embarrassed by exactly one name inside the speech, and moved to clean up that one name only, which tells you, without anybody ever confirming a phone call, that the pressure point in this whole story was never Rory, was never Mal, was never Joe Budden, was never Drake, and was never the podcast circuit. The pressure point was Kareem Biggs Burke. Full stop. And Rick Ross's own edit list. On Rick Ross's own timeline is the receipt. There's also the quiet question of what happens next inside the Rockefeller Circle, because these situations rarely end where they visibly end. The internet moves on in 48 hours. The industry does not. The industry keeps a very long, very patient list, and Rick Ross's name just got a small pencil mark next to it. Not a red mark, not a black mark, a small pencil mark that says, remember this one when the next opportunity comes across the desk. That pencil mark does not stop Rick Ross from eating. Rick Ross is going to keep eating. But that pencil mark absolutely changes the seat Rick Ross gets at future tables, the timing of certain callbacks, and the enthusiasm behind certain cosigns. Nobody will ever announce it. Nobody has to. That is exactly how the room has always worked. Rewind the whole week, and notice a smaller detail nobody is highlighting. Rick Ross did not just retract words. Rick Ross specifically retracted the words aimed at Kareem Biggs Burke, while leaving almost everything else in the original rant untouched. That is a surgical retraction. That is not somebody who woke up embarrassed, by which brings a conversation to you. What do you actually believe happened here? Do you believe Rick Ross saw the reaction on his own and decided, like a grown boss, to walk it back before it grew any bigger? Or do you believe a phone rang somewhere in the middle of the night with a voice on the other end that Rick Ross could not afford to argue with? Do you believe Kareem Biggs Burke is truly untouchable, protected by a code the whole industry still respects? Or do you believe Rick Ross just did the math and picked a smart move? Drop it in the comments, because this conversation is not close to over. There are still verses that have not been recorded, statements that have not been made, and camera phones that have not been pointed yet. If this breakdown connected any dots for you that your timeline missed, hit the like, tap subscribe, and turn the notifications on. Because the second the next update drops on Rick Ross, Kareem Biggs Burke, or JayZ, this channel is going to be first on it. Until then, stay locked in, stay paying attention, and remember the rule this whole story just wrote in permanent marker. The loudest man in the room is almost never the most powerful man in the room. See you in the next one.